welcome to the Resilient Mental State podcast. I'm Kyle Shepard, husband, father, and resilience instructor of over 10 years. Join me as I sit down with writers, independent thinkers, and extraordinary individuals to discuss their unique wisdom through the lens of resilience. Resilience is the ability to effectively manage and recover from stress. It is essential to endure and grow from life's inevitable adversities. Resilience is a skill that can be trained.
Conor Heffernan. So I'm a big fan of origin stories. And often when I talk to people, I love, which will definitely come up today, talking about their personal origin stories. But you are responsible for making me become a big fan and extremely interested in the origin of fitness and physical culture. I tend not to be a historian. I guess I've become one more in my adult years for certain realms that I operate in. But for a very avid athlete and person who loves fitness, I've never thought much about where certain workouts come from, some of these figures, and where certain systems were derived. Everything seems like it's brand new, and of course it's promoted that way these days. But no, you are a very prevalent and popular historian of fitness and physical culture. You're also a professor at Ulster University in Ireland and an author of at least 4 books that I'm aware of. The History of Physical Culture in Ireland. You have a book on Indian swinging clubs, which is really cool. I want to look into that and maybe talk about that a little bit. You have the book that's sitting behind me, The History of Physical Culture, and then the newly released When Fitness Went Global. And I think you're working on like 5 more. I'm curious, for my first question for you, going back to origin stories for people, what originally got you interested in the origin of fitness and physical culture?
Being terrible at history is the answer. So I did history for my undergrad, and I was so bad, like the worst. Like I would hate if one of my students was like me. I didn't go to class. I wasn't bothered. My assignments were trash because I was like, it was like medieval Irish history. I'm not throwing shade on it. It was like French medieval kingship, and I was like, this is so boring. Again, everyone has their own peccadillos. I had one history professor who just got angry with me. And it's kind of upsetting how often a good thing happens to me after someone gets angry with me. And they're like, what do you want? You know, like when you're like a stroppy teenager, they're like, you don't like this, you don't like that. What do you like? And I was like, I like going to the gym. And they just kind of like threw their hands up in the air. They're like, just do that. They're like, just do a history on that. They're like, just write a paper on this. So I wrote a paper on Charles Atlas, you know, the dynamic tension guy pushing one muscle against the next. And it just kind of kept rolling from there. Like at some point, I should have been stopped. And I don't mean this in like a motivational way. I mean, at some point, someone should have like put a hand on my shoulder and be like, the world does not need a history of fitness, my dear simple boy. But it's just from being a terrible undergraduate and kind of finding my niche with this. And it's really funny. I was talking to someone who's like an exercise scientist, and they're like, well, I wanted to know, I wanted evidence for what works. And I was like, I was terrible at science. So I went to the history to try and get the evidence of what works. And when you go down the history route, it's a lot more fun, I would say. There's a lot more characters, but there's also a lot less useful information outside of this person's a shyster, this is a lie, this won't work, we should have done more of this. So it all started from being a really bad undergrad who loved going to the gym above anything else.
Well, I'm glad no one stopped you, because your posts and what I've read from your book are equally insightful and brilliant. And it's just so interesting to think about where some of these exercises we do or systems that we pursue originally came from, and kind of the ups and downs of, you think something was created in the 1990s. I bet it was created in the 1700s or 1800s, like you often illuminate in your posts. So I'm glad no one stopped you, because they're equally interesting and insightful, but also extremely entertaining, even for the darks, like the dark side of some of these origin stories, which there are many. And we'll talk about some of them today. But it's fascinating to see, like, there's not a lot of extremely revelationary things happening in the fitness industry. It's just kind of repackaged, repurposed, or slightly modified, which is great. We stand on the shoulder of giants and then we find ways to maybe refine a little bit, make it useful for us. But yeah, these people marketing like this brand new thing, it often is not. And these posts illuminate that you create.
I know, thank you. And I think, like the fitness industry is inherently silly. Like, let's just be it's very silly. And one of my favorite things is It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. There's a scene where one of the characters, Mac, gets ripped and shredded out of nowhere. And there's a scene where he just like takes off his top, he's like, boom. And all of his friends are like, okay. And he's like, no, like I'm ripped now, like I'm so lean. And they're like, okay, Mac, like we're just gonna keep doing what we're doing. And that's kind of the thing we forget is like lots of us, fitness is our lives. For the general population, it's a weird thing that we do. And the characters who lead the way in fitness tend to be weird people. So like I don't think you can tell the story without telling the silliness of it. And like, it's so silly. One of my favorite stories, which is in John Fair's book, Muscletown, USA, it's about Bob Hoffman, the creator of York Barbell, who also sold supplements. So there's a story about Bob Hoffman in the 1960s making his own protein powder. Now you're probably saying like, Connor, whatever, okay, who's selling? Someone walked in and they saw Bob Hoffman sweating over a vat of soy protein powder. He was mixing it with a rowing oar and pouring in Hershey's cocoa powder, and every now and then dipping his hand into the vat to taste it and then saying, oh no, needs more sweetener, and going again. It's like, how can you tell that story and treat this whole thing as serious? So, I mean, like, it probably should be treated more seriously, but it's never been a serious industry.
I love that. And I do love not taking anything too seriously, but really highlighting the silliness because obviously fitness has tremendous benefits for our health, well being, and some of these mindsets and even skills that we derive from fitness can be translated elsewhere. But to think that being fit is somehow superior to anything else or that it earns you some degree like some pedigree in another domain where it's not as important to other people getting after it in other ways. The fitness can benefit anyone, but to think it's the end all be all and then preach it as such, it's very refreshing to see that because obviously you're a fan of fitness, but refreshing to see where you come from to just highlight the pros and cons of a lot of what we do these days and forever.
For sure. And like there's the fitness industry, which is silly and slapstick and full of shysters. And then there's like actual fitness itself. So like I'm controversial. I'm pro fitness. I think, fitness, physical activity, health, whatever that means for people, spending time doing it is inherently a net good. What I'm more skeptical and like kind of suspiciously eyeing is the fitness industry, which is saying, Kyle, is often like, this is the newest thing. No one's ever done this. 6-week abs. I'm lean year round. I'm natural, blah, blah. Like all of these things that we see again and again and again. And I think sometimes we confuse the act of going to the gym, stretching, doing resistance training, working out with the fitness industry. And I think for me, like I'm so pro fitness, but the fitness industry is always on a little bit like, I'm a little bit uncomfortable now.
Yeah, and then finding the overlap between the two, because anytime you become public facing, whether it's success in a certain domain or a business person trying to sell something that might be intentionally for the betterment of someone's health, there's going to inherently be overlap into that industry lane and how you leverage that and what you use and the 6 minute stuff. I mean, I definitely believe you can get in some quality work in a short amount of time, but to package it in such a way like, here is your shortcut, spend this much money, follow this exact system. This is a one size fits all. You are good to go if you do just this and that, and forget everything else. Throw on that electric. My dad had this back in the way. I hate to call you out, Dad, but there was like that strap that electrocuted your abs and like tensed them up and released
Yeah.
them. So like basically contraction and then release, contraction, release. I remember walking in, he's sitting on the couch and it was shocking. I'm like, what the hell is that thing? And he starts explaining to me because he fell for that trap back in probably the 90s of when it happened. He was getting after it in other ways, but he thought that was a passive way to enhance his abs.
Yeah, and I love that. So we had one in our house, and I remember putting it on, and like one of my friends coming and being like, "So you would rather sit there electrocuting yourself than going for a run with me?" And just the way they said it, there was such like unintentional pity in their voice. I was like, "Yeah, okay, I think I'll just let me just take off the like octopus like suction cups on my stomach and we'll go outside. But like, that's not a rare phenomenon. Like even in something that I love doing, and I have a cupboard here with 4 or 5 of them beside me. But like you look at the first like major fitness equipment, which is like Eugene Sandow's dumbbell in the early 1900s. Sandow is seen as the world's most perfectly developed man. The Natural History Museum does a statue of Sandow's body in the early 1900s to show later generations how perfect he was. He clearly built his body with heavy weight training. For the general public, he says, you don't need to lift heavy. All you need to do is lift my 5 pound dumbbell and squeeze it as tightly as possible, because concentration will build this big muscular physique. So, like, our origin stories are about shortcuts because, like, and I know you know this, like, fitness is really boring in the sense of it takes a long time to make progress. And it's funny, earlier today I was looking at a clip of Phil Heath, the multiple time Mr. Olympia bodybuilding champion, and he's in a nightclub, and there's some young guys who are like talking to him about his drug protocols. Not Phil Heath's. This is the young guy's drugs, and they're like, "I'm on this amount of tests. I'm on this amount of blah blah blah." And Phil looks at him again with a not dissimilar face of unintentional pity, and he's like, "Why are you doing this?" He's like, "What are you, 18?" He's like, "Yeah." He's like, why didn't you just train and exercise for like, and eat right for a couple of years? Like, oh, I want to get big. And Phil's like, damn, man, don't do this. So like, we've always had a human impulse to like get rich quick, get rich without trying, get big, get healthy, etc. And like there's always been a market for people, even like well-intentioned people like Sandow is a shyster, but he also hosts the world's first bodybuilding show in 1901. He does a lot of good with fitness. So like even people who are like, as you said, kind of straddling the line between altruism and capitalism, even they sell stuff that is like get rich quick. And we've been doing it for over 100 years.
And in Sandow's defense, like there's obviously a place for squeezing something as tight as possible or lifting 5 pound weights for the person who needs to build the stimulus. However, when you preach it as this is the way to look like me, acting like you haven't done anything else, now it gets really dicey, really corrupt, really quick. And you have so many great stories about him because there is a place for that. However, you approach it from the industrial perspective of trying to make money into one neat, clean system that's going to apply to everybody. I'm sure he made quite a bit of money on it, but I don't know how virtuous he was in that pursuit.
Yeah, and like, one of my favorite fitness writers, Dan John, always says everything works for about 6 weeks. And this is the thing that you get like Sandow or Joe Weider or Bob Hoffman or anyone who's come in like in recent years will preach the one system that fits all. And it's funny because I wrote something a couple of weeks ago about like what does fitness actually mean? And the thing that we often forget is that fitness is the ability to complete a task. So if Kyle, for example, you're running a 5K, you know, fitness for you means running a 5K in a certain amount of time. But then you decide, oh, listen, I don't really like running. I'm going to do high rocks. So then, fitness for high rocks means something completely different. You then say, listen, the flashing lights and Instagram isn't for me. I want to go into powerlifting. Fitness for powerlifting means something different. But what you often see is in the fitness industry, we sell this kind of clear-eyed idea of fitness. You will get fit if you do this. You will get strong if you do that. You will get lean if you do this. So like all of the definitions even that we use are shaky. So as I said, Sandow's 5 pound dumbbells. Yeah, 100%. That's that's effective. You know what I mean? You can actually get a decent workout from that. It's effectively isometric training with a little bit of weight attached to it. But it's the additional sell, right? It's the you will look like me. And like the man had brass balls because he would send people a drawing of his own body, like an illustrated like body chart. His anatomy chart, that's the word. And then he would have his measurements, and then he would have a little blank box where you could put your measurements and track how closely you are getting to him. And so that's where you're like, okay, now the 5 pound isometric training, now it's probably not doing what you're promising. So there's always that little ledge, where I'm like, I'm going to get more people moving. You're like, brilliant. And I'm going to tell them that. And they're like, it's the sell is the thing where the issue lies.
Yeah, I wonder how many people were able to fill in that row using 5-pound dumbbells to get to his metrics. I would guess the number is 0 if they followed only that system.
Yeah, it's weird though, right? It's almost like everyone has a different height and different genetics. It's really weird. I don't know if Sandow knew that at the time. I mean, obviously modern science has advanced so much since then to know that people look different, but anyway.
Individual variability. Go figure. What I really appreciate in that post that you wrote about what fitness is and what you do in many posts is you'll highlight, of course, the pros of certain systems like High Rocks, which you've written on, or
Mhm.
CrossFit, or powerlifting, or endurance training. There's inherently pros, and if that matches your goals, absolutely get after it. But to again, when it comes to the systems, to act like High Rocks is the new CrossFit. It's the end all be all for this complete, fully functional fitness in every domain of life. And it's just not possible when you consider all the adaptations that we can pursue from strength to endurance to stamina to power to speed to skill, you name it. There's just too many for you to pursue all of them at the same time and maximize it out. It's just not possible. You can definitely raise the floor in certain areas, and some of these systems like CrossFit and High Rocks probably do a good job overall if those are your goals and you enjoy it of raising the floor in multiple domains at one time. But you do such a good job of showing the nuance that has to be everywhere. While people will still be like, "This is the holy grail of fitness. Now we figured it out. We are good to go. This is the new thing. We have settled the score for what is perfect."
Yeah, and like sometimes you don't want to be the person in the room who's like putting their hand up and being like, "Well, actually, there was a writer in England, Ben Goldker, was an absolute dude, but he would oftentimes like debunk like alternative medical claims or just like false medical claims, and his catchphrase became, "I think you'll find it's a little bit more complicated than that." And this is something in fitness. It's like, I think you'll find it's a little bit more complicated than that because we don't have agreed definitions on anything. So, like, there's a really good paper being written that I managed to tack myself onto, which is about it's a philosophical paper around what is strength, and it's using World's Strongest Man as an example of something that is attempted to understand what strength is. And strongman's a really funny example of this, right? Because me and you could say, well, strong is strong. You go, okay, we all agree that strong is strong. But then you look at like Hafthor Bjornsson is deadlifted 510 kilos. Okay, and we're like, whew, okay, strongest man in the world. Absolutely. There's a 20-year-old powerlifter who just pulled 500 kilos for 2 reps, but he did it in a sumo deadlift. And Hafthor did it in a conventional deadlift. And people are like, what if Colton, the 20-year-old, catches, or 20 something year old, catches up with Hafthor? And everyone's, no, 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 no. Hafthor did conventional, Colton did sumo, completely different. And you're like, if we can't even agree what strong is, like, do you know what I mean? We can't even agree what strong is. So, like, Eddie Hall deadlifts 500 kilos, incredible, nearly kills himself in the process of making that lift. Colton does 2 reps with straps in sumo, and people are like, yeah, no, but like Eddie's stronger though because he did conventional. Because they're like the biomechanics in a sumo deadlift are more advantageous. And like, if we can't agree that just lifting the most amount of weight from the floor makes you strong, and we put quibbles and asterisks to that, what happens when we add the word fitness into that or fit? Are you fit? And that's one of the things that we've always had, I think, this desire for our chosen pursuit to, as you say, be the be all and end all. So before High Rocks, it was CrossFit, and Greg Glassman did an amazing thing where he was like, I don't care if you deadlift 600 pounds, I care if you deadlift 400 pounds and then run a 5 minute mile straight afterwards. I was like, okay, but there's two still really specific things that we're doing. And like even, physical culture 100 years ago, the very origins of fitness, it was a sense of like, okay, do this one training system. Pooh, okay, great. Now you're fit. And these is something that we've always grappled. Before CrossFit, we had the whole functional fitness craze, which is the most insane thing in the world, where people are like, well, there's not a lot of 400-pound shopping bags. How is a deadlift functional? I was like, but none of this is functional in the sense that we pretend it is. Like it is ultimately fitness is a really niche thing. So, as you say, if you want to pursue powerlifting, you force your body to adapt in really specific ways. Likewise, when you do weightlifting, bodybuilding, obviously there's certain movements and you have to learn how to pose and all these things. Running a marathon, your body learns how to adapt and become more efficient. So like rather than trying to box ourselves into one pathway, we should probably celebrate the fact that our bodies are dumb bags of meat that just do what we ask them to. Now, not always efficiently, but like it'll try its best, if you force it to do a stimulus. But there is something I think both very human about wanting what you do to be the right thing. Like, listen, when I write fitness, it's the best thing that anyone has ever done, and everyone should be studying the history of fitness. But the person doing the French Revolution, that's been done. We know what that. You know what I mean? We always want our thing to be correct. Likewise in fitness, we do want it to be correct, but we also have this like undetermined idea of what is healthy, what is fit. We know we should be healthy, but what does that mean? We know we should be fit. Well, what does that mean? We know we should look good. Well, what does that, because the definitions are never actually talked about, it's really hard to know like when you're at enough. And this is where I go back to again my favorite author, Dan John, where he makes a distinction between everyday strength and like peak strength. So, if you're a powerlifter, you work up to like a 600-pound deadlift, you hit that in a meet, you might never be able to hit that again. But everyday strength, you can always go into a gym and guarantee that you can hit X amount of weight. And I think we often don't work through definitions. And because there's a vagueness then, it's really easy to sell things to people, right? And I always come back to selling, but so much of the fitness industry is selling. I was talking to people who train personal trainers in England recently, and the number one thing that personal trainers struggle to deal with is how much of their job is sales and pitching. And that's because fitness is sales. And if you have like a rigid definition, okay, I'm the personal trainer who will bring your deadlift up 100 pounds and that's it. That doesn't sound as good as I'm going to make you fit, I'm going to make you healthy, I'm going to make you strong. Okay, stay with me because now you're on the treadmill. You know what I mean? The metaphorical treadmill. You'll never be strong enough, you'll never be fit enough, you'll never be healthy enough. And like, obviously, people don't want to sit down and have these conversations because they're boring, they're hard. They involve people like me putting their hand up and saying, well, actually, but it is something to consider because there's kind of a beauty in the vagueness of it. Because if you accept that no one knows what the F they're doing, then you can define it on your own terms. And you can say, well, for me, fitness is this. And that's actually just as valid as what the person trying to sell you stuff is doing. Because again, our bodies, dumb bags of meat, as you said, they adapt to stimulus. So choose what you want, pick a goal. If you hit it, woohoo, pick another goal and keep going. But don't pretend like your fitness is better than someone else's fitness. Like if I go to a high rocks class, my ass gets handed to me on a plate because I'm not used to it. If the person who brought me to a high rocks class tries to lift natural stones with me, well, they might actually still be stronger than me, but, they will find it harder because they've never done that before. Am I stronger than them? Yeah, and my really specific thing that I'm spending years doing. Are they stronger than me? Yeah, and that really specific thing that they're spending years doing. But it doesn't mean one's better than the other. Apart from CrossFit, which we can agree is I'm only messing. I think we're finished ragging on CrossFit now. That was like a fun 10-year period, but I feel like we're finished that now.
I think so too.
Yeah, okay. The joke has ended. Okay.
This is what I love about your writing is that you don't call anything correct. And it's very hard if you're trying to sell something, but you're trying to sell open-mindedness and letting people realize that we are adaptable. My favorite principle is the SAID principle, specific adaptations to impose demands. And that means reps in the exact area that you're trying to get better. And if you do that, you'll get better there. And it may cause some sacrifices or compromises elsewhere as you get there. So to be like, it's funny, you were talking about functional fitness. I call myself, because I couldn't think of a better term, a functional fitness coach through the jiu-jitsu gym that I coach in. But really, my whole philosophy is like, I will have classes focus on specific adaptations to say what we're focused on today and why. Think about perceived exertion rates and modifications for everybody. And my favorite classes are when I have like an 8-year-old child in them and an 80-year-old at the same time. And we're doing burpees, which I'm pretty adapted at. And so I'm at a time back in the day when I was training to go after a world record, I was doing the training for this workout with an 80-year-old next to me, getting after it in his way, and an 8-year-old doing burpees for the first time in the same class, while we're all just practicing the adaptation here for that class in that way. But really, I was just hoping for be educational. Like my goal is that you'd like keep coming because the class is free whenever you want. But my goal is like you learn about these and that I get from writers like you on Substack. You learn about these opportunities so you can start being your own coach. And then when you want to get really better, lean on a personal trainer, which by the way, you're my favorite personal trainers, Scott Shetler's favorite source of wisdom and knowledge when it comes to, which is why we met in the first place. And as I started exploring your writing, I see exactly why, because it's open-ended. Anything is possible. You'll give the origin story, you'll give the systems, you'll say where it is today, but at the end of the day, you make the decision for what works for you. And I'd love to hear, you were mentioning, which I could not agree more, the importance of definitions. And yes, if we're not talking about the same thing, if I'm saying functional fitness, which I try to describe in my way there, but you mean something completely different. You mean CrossFit, because that's kind of what functional fitness was for a few decades, or at least a decade. And don't get me wrong, there's many aspects of CrossFit that are help you be functionally fit. How do you define fitness?
That's a tough one, and I I do go back to adaptations. Like, this is the really funny thing, and I think, I'm really lucky. I'll just say that forthright outright now. I'm so lucky because I have a job in a university which is funded by taxpayers, and I work my ass off to try and justify that. Bearing in mind I study the history of fitness, so I really work my ass off to try and justify their wages. But I don't have to sell anything. So that's why I'm in a really privileged position that I can actually sit on the fence, and as much as someone can, with all of their bias and prejudices and anti-High Rocks agenda, call balls and strikes. Because of that, my definition of fitness is really open. And what I mean by that, so I did 2 natural bodybuilding shows. For me, when I was in that headspace, fitness in that context meant getting down to 4 or 5% body fat, being able to hold poses for 30 seconds to a minute, and also being as lean as possible, or as muscular as possible on stage. 3 really specific fitness goals. Actually, if I could sum up natural bodybuilding and fitness, it was striated glutes, being so lean you could see the muscles in my ass. That was basically my definition of fitness. I went into a very failed effort at Olympic weightlifting because genetics do matter. Long limbs, slow muscle fibers, not a great combination for a ballistic sport. But again, fitness, when I moved into that, it was all about clean and jerk and snatch. That's it. Anything else I was doing was to that metric. Moved into powerlifting, again, big 3, squat, bench, deadlift. Fine. Start breaking down because of powerlifting, my own stupidity, not the sport. Move into something, as why I really love Scott's work. Started to kind of play around with West Side and then Jim Wendler's principles, which is kind of like this lower, slower adaptation and building strength over the long term as opposed to short term. And then I discover stone lifting because my good friend David Keown helps to reignite natural stone lifting or historic stone lifting in the island of Ireland. So now my idea of fitness is kind of everyday strength. How many reps can I do with this moderately heavy weight? And can I go to that field over there and pick up that stone? So, like, this is my own journey, and you can see even in that how that idea of fitness has shifted so many times. I have a friend who runs marathons. His idea of fitness started with a 20-minute jog. If I can do that, I'm fit. He moved into 5Ks, he moved into park runs, he moved into marathons, he's now doing ultra marathons, and eventually he's going to settle into triathlons. Every step of the way, his idea of fitness changes because we change and what we want from fitness changes. And this is why as you say, Anna, it is both a cop out, but I also think a pleasure to be able to say, you know what, we don't need to be so dogmatic. And this is something that I think it might be just be what Irish people love doing, but I don't like being told what to do. And I think that I know that's not a uniquely Irish thing, but we're really good at like talking smack behind someone's back after they've told us what to do. And I feel like so much of fitness is telling us exactly what we should do. This is the goal. This is what fitness is. We are doing this and nothing else. And that's fine, but we evolve. And I think if you've been around fitness for more than 2 or 3 years, your motivations have probably changed. I don't think you ever stop setting goals, and those goals reflect what you think fitness is. So, and this is again, part of the problem is that I strive for openness. And this is something that got me in a bit of trouble. I was at a strength and conditioning conference in Ireland, and we were in this kind of group breakout session. And I asked one of the coaches, I said, if your athlete moves from a 180 kilo deadlift to a 190 kilo deadlift, or a 150 squat to a 160 squat. Have they gotten better? He goes, yes, yeah, they've gotten better. They're stronger. I said, okay, but have they gotten better at their sport? And he goes, well, yes, they've gotten better at this sport. They're stronger now. And I said, okay, but how much better have they? Like, are they kicking more points? Are they covering more space on the field? Are they better at tackling? Are they? Oh, I don't know. And I asked, like in an S&C conference, this is a horrible thing to ask. I was like, what's enough? And they're like, what? And I was like, what's enough? I was like, what is the minimum baseline of strength that once we get there, we're good? You know what I mean? Like, we can still pursue it, but we've gotten enough for the sport. And like, because S&C, you need to justify your input. And we know that S&C coaches are immensely valuable within sports, but they also struggle to find proof that they are useful, in the sense of, well, what's the easiest way? Oh, they got leaner. Oh, they got stronger. They're not as injury prone. But we can't tell you what numbers will get us to the most benefit. So when I asked them, like, what's enough, they were like, oh, we don't like we don't like these questions, Conor. And I was like, no, it's just academic curiosity. So it's a very long-winded way of saying, like, I think it's important that we swim in the water of uncertainty when it comes to what fitness is. Because if you box yourself in, you'll burn yourself out in many respects when it comes to moving your body. Because, and I know you're the exact same as me, you move through multiple hats when you're in fitness. And even something could be as simple as, well, I'm still within the sport, but now I approach it differently. Or I still do, like, listen, I still squat, bench, deadlift, overhead press. I've been doing that since I was 14. But how I do that now is so different to what I would have done even 10 years ago. Even though, like, sometimes to the eye it looks the exact same, but like how I program it, my internal body cues, my internal tension, all of these things are so different. So when we say what is fitness, I always start with, like, well, what do you like? And then how does that compare? And that comparison piece can be to other people. I think when you start off within a sport, you need to compare yourself to other people to get a benchmark. So you need to look ahead, and like, martial arts are really good for that, because you can literally just look up the belt system, or you can just talk to people and, how long have you been doing this? Fitness is harder because, you start off, you go into the gym, maybe you've been working on a farm or with your family's construction company for 10 years growing up. Like, you rep like 225 on the bench press for 18 reps, first time in the gym. I come in and I'm struggling with the bar. Fitness is a lot harder. So I think you start off with comparisons to yourself, or with others, pardon me, for what is fitness, or what is fit, or what is strong. And then the longer you've been in it, the more you get a sense of where you are in that spectrum. And then you can start to put in those, like, more nuanced pieces of, oh, well, for me in this sport, fitness means X or Y.
I really like what you did in that you gave a definition, but then you made it open ended and embraced uncertainty with it. Because fitness, if I were to try and summarize what you said, is physical adaptations in alignment with the way you want to live and your goals at the time, which may change over time. So yeah, it's adaptations, but in alignment with what's best for your life right now and what you're focusing on. But you also said something that I remind myself of often, because I'm also very lucky and privileged to serve in the Navy, and I have a full-time job. The stuff that I do on Substack, the jujitsu stuff, the functional fitness stuff, it's all because I love it. And so, like, you could look at it like it's a volunteer thing that I do it for free. I'd be doing it anyways, and to do it with other people, I enjoy it, and I'm very lucky for that. So I'm not trying to sell anything. And if it were my profession, I were needing to sell things, I would need to dip my toes in that lane and be in the industry and figure out, how do I sell myself, and how do I would like to think, emulate the trainers and the sources of wisdom like you, which Scott is one of those people. Scott, like, when I talk to Scott, Scott is not, this is, you follow this strictly and you will get stronger. He can give you what he's done, sure, but what are your goals? Where are you going? Here are systems. Here, how you can think about your starting ranges. And here's how we can talk about recovery and everything else. But that's very hard to do when you're trying to market at scale outside, because you can't have one-on-one conversations with everybody and explain your philosophy. So how do you package that cleanly in a post or in a website? And I would imagine that would be very challenging to do so and not be grossed out by it.
But I think it's just as you said, it's the nature of sales, because you, like, once
Yeah.
it is anything. Once money enters the equation, you have to respond to the money. Like, that is unfortunately part of it, you know. And if you are an elite coach and you want to make money so that you can train athletes, so that you can do good within sport or within the world, you do need to sell something to sustain yourself. Now, sometimes you can get lucky, so not lucky, but you can be fortunate. It's like a really cool example for me is, you know, Mark Bell, he invents the slingshot, you know, which helps people with the bench press. He then runs his own gym, which is free for people for like years. Do you know what I mean? So like, or even, you know, Jim Wendler's a really good example, makes money from the 531 training programs, then volunteers his time training kids for football in his home state. So like you can be fortunate sometimes in the sense that the thing that you sell is relatively benign, you know, and then that allows you to make money to do the things that you really love. But like sometimes it's like, okay, I need to sell my system. And if, you know, I'm selling my, you know, let's say my 6-4-2 program, or, you know, my 6x6 program, or, you know, my East Side barbell program, I do have to say, like, oh, well, this is good, this is trash. Or, like, you know, I've taken 5x5 strong lifts and I've added my own twist to make it more effective. Or this is the best hypertrophy program you're ever going to get. Here's my D tier, C tier, S tier training programs, blah, blah. Here's how to move from 400 to 500 pounds. Here's how to, blah, blah. So like, but like this is important in another sense, because if, and it goes back to something that you were saying, like if you know what you want, it's really useful to have those systems, because you can like, and it's never been easier, to be honest. You know, you can follow someone on YouTube, on Substack, on Instagram, on TikTok, get a sense for who they are as a salesperson, you know, or as an individual, and then you can buy their system and see if it works. But you're buying it hopefully in the knowledge that it will improve you in some way. And I think actually the strength sports are probably the most honest about this, in the sense that they will oftentimes sell their bench press program, or their squat program, or their deadlift program. You know, like it's really specific. It's like, you know, there's a home DIY brand that no longer exists, and they'd say it does what it says on the tin. That used to be their advertisement. It does what it says on the tins. You know, the squat program or small of bench, you know, by the end of this program, your bench press will be this much higher, roughly. This will improve your deadlift. Then you get into like the general public systems, and it's like hypertrophy program. And you're thinking, you're kind of scratching your head going, isn't all weight training kind of on a hypertrophy, you know, focus? Like, I know it's strength training, blah, blah. Or, you know, it's like get lean. And you're like, okay, but like, why is this system any better than any of the other? So, like, it can be both a huge benefit, but it can also be a bit of a curse. But it is actually just a natural consequence of like capitalism. Like, not to be a raging Marxist, but it is just capitalism. Like, once money enters the equation, you need to differentiate yourself from someone else. And now, because so much of fitness is online, like, it doesn't really work for me if I'm like, hey, I'm Conor Heffernan, you know, I sell a jiu-jitsu hypertrophy program. You know who's also great? Kyle, my competitor over here. It works better to be like, oh, like his program, you know, that sucks. It's trash. He's not using science, or, you know, like he's a science guy. I'm an in the weeds guy, or, you know, in the trenches guy. Like it drives off of rivalries. And it's funny, like that's always, some people think like online fitness has made things worse. It's just really exacerbated things. So, you know, if we go back to the 1940s, 1950s, you have Joe Weider, the bodybuilding entrepreneur, and you have Bob Hoffman, the Olympic weightlifting guy, trashing each other's programs. This is awful. This isn't gonna, you know, that just builds vanity muscles. That doesn't build functional muscles like weight training. And they're just at each other's throats. And then you look at their training programs and you're like, my brothers in Christ, these are basically the same programs, except you're focusing on, you know, 2 Olympic lifts once a week, and you're focusing on like squat and bench more so. You know what I mean? Like, it's the differences don't justify the anger, unless you understand that they're trying to pull people away from the other guy, entrench people into certain mindsets. But the reason they're doing that is money. So, like, again, this is where I wish, and I've said this to so many people, I really wish when you entered a gym for the first time, you were almost given like a map. You know, like, okay, so here's what's going to happen. here are the pitfalls, here are the things to avoid, here are the things that you use when you need it. You know what I mean? But we all just get dropped into this chaotic burning fire. And then sometimes you'll get lucky and you'll meet someone or you'll stumble across like yourself or Scott or anyone else who knows what they're talking about. Or you'll just get lost and then you're just following, an Instagrammer or a TikToker until you buy their program and you realize the program is trash or they've taken your money and not given you the program. So like there's so many minefields for people to try and step around in fitness. But that's kind of always been the case. Since the 1890s at least, that's always been the case.
And I really wonder if maps were available, at least in today's day and age, like you mentioned, you go online, whether it's I'm not on TikTok, but I hear people get a lot of stuff from there. Of course, the Instagrams, which I follow, certain fitness accounts, Substack. Just Google whatever you want. You're going to find a program for free, or you can pay for some with people who are a little bit more credible, or maybe not. Maybe they're corrupt. You don't know until you do it. But like, there's so much knowledge out there. And so you mentioned when you were powerlifting that either I think you said you burned yourself out or something happened. God,
Mhm.
I've done that so many times in my life. Even though I've had experiences similar to that before, I should have known better. I've done it recently. I did the super squat program a year or two ago. I and I didn't slow down all of my burpee stuff and all of my so I wasn't recovering. I fit super squat into my jujitsu training schedule, into all my functional fitness stuff, still doing all the high intensity stuff. My recovery was sleep and trying to eat a little bit more, chugging all the
Yep.
milk, doubled up the creatine. I'm guessing that's why I have this gluten intolerance now, and it happened during that time. I think my system just went kaput. I screwed up my gut. I don't know what happened. I got up to the highest squat that I've ever done in my life for sure, but then my body failed me, and I dialed back, and I'll still do heavy squats, but I leaned in so hard without thinking about true recovery, and because I just wanted to supplement all the stuff I was doing without focusing on that for a little while. Because maybe super squat is great if you focus on that, you truly focus on recovery, but I didn't let it align with my goals. I just try to squeeze it in. And we get lost so quickly because knowledge doesn't equate to wisdom. Like having that experience
Mm.
is so important. So I think like maps would be really beneficial in talking to individuals like Scott who have, or maybe me who's been a shithead 100 times in my life, and maybe I can try to help you prevent being a shithead. But I think being a shithead, hopefully without serious injury or death, can be beneficial for you to learn. I think I've learned a little bit, even though my recent issue with the super squat, maybe I haven't so much. But that wisdom comes from experience, and it's important to have that. And the trainers, incredible people I look for, are often the ones that are not like, this is what you need to do in this way, but it's more open ended and really having you make sure you do it in a safe, modified, built up way, which is what I try to emulate because of the positive influences I've had.
Yeah, and I think like you can get really lucky with your mentors, and something that I got lucky with when I stopped doing natural bodybuilding and I burned out. Like my genetics are just not made for natural bodybuilding, but I burned out in powerlifting, and I went to another coach, and he was like, "Okay, let's track out your injury history." So I'm like, "Okay, so I tore a hamstring here. I had lower back pain here. I had sciatica for a couple months," and he did a timeline. And then he's like, you seem like the type of person who track your training programs. I'm like, yeah, yeah, yeah. So then, yeah, you can probably see where this is going. We laid out the training programs, and we're kind of starting to get like a little correlation going here. And then he's like, you're doing like lay out your career history here. So I'm like, okay, started masters, moved to a different country, PhD, moved to a different country, first job, moved to a different country, moved back from a different country. It's like, okay, cool, cool, cool. Now add in everything else. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, like getting a dog, person dying in family, marriage, blah blah. And then he's like, okay, and now you cycle a lot, right? I'm like, yeah, yeah, yeah. Now give me your commute over this time. What did it look like? So effectively, it was long winded. Like it was 40 minutes, but it's probably the most useful 40 minutes I've ever had. Where we're like tracking, and he's like, every time you red line, and what I mean by that is you go overboard in your training. So like you did a peak week in powerlifting, you got some form of elbow, shoulder, knee, or back pain about 10 to 14 days afterwards. I was like, huh, that's weird. And he's like, maybe you do too much. And I was like, but, but I'm the most special boy in the world. And he was like, but this is like where you're like, oh, okay, oh, like I'm going to do super squats, but like, we don't subtract, we always add. And like this is something I've done myself. Even like I was deadlifting yesterday and I was feeling really good and I was working up to a top set and I pulled a heavy set for one and like, "Do you I'm gonna go for a PR." I was like, that's it. I was going and I'm loading the plates up onto the bar and I'm like, the coach just popped into my head and he's like, "You don't need to do this." And I was like, "Yeah, I don't need to do it." And I stripped the bar and I put it back. I'm like, in 14 days' time, I am gonna be so happy that I did not pull for a heavy single. Injury, though, is the best teacher with a lot of these things. But I think the thing that you're alluding to is important, that again, in fitness, I think we oftentimes make the mistake that more is better and that progress is a singular straight line, and if that worked correctly, everyone would be squatting 700 or 800 pounds because, they're adding 2.5 pounds each side, etc. But like we have that temptation to add, and it's not, more is better, it's more is more. And your body, no matter how well conditioned you are, will break down. But it's really hard not to try that because, especially, I think if you've been in fitness long enough, you are someone who enjoys pushing themselves. But also, if you've been in fitness long enough, you are someone who needs a challenge every now and then just to gauge where you're at, what's working well, and just to kind of excite you again. So you always have that tension between what you should do and what you want to do. And what you want to do is usually way too much. And there's that, again, Dan Johnism of if you're your own client, your coach has an idiot for a client. It's the idea of like just giving, if you can find someone you trust and you don't have to be paying for a personal trainer, it can be following someone's information online. But like usually giving up a little bit of your own decision making to someone else can be really beneficial as long as you find the right people, right? And it's finding the right people is the trickiest thing because we have a natural inclination to try and push and push and push.
I couldn't agree more. Like the benefit of a coach and a mentor, someone you can rely on that's trustworthy and credible, has knowledge in that realm, has experience in that realm to hopefully help you prevent significant experience and injuries. Like you said, they're great teachers, but man, some of those bad injuries can set you back or, God forbid, change your life. And there are plenty of stories for that. But my second favorite principle after the said principle that we talked about earlier is progressive overload. And of course, we know that's how you get better in a domain. That's how you continue the adaptations on the path that you're moving. But you said it. That's true when you add that you enhance the stressor and the stimulus so you can continue to adapt. But when you don't subtract elsewhere, because I am very very stubborn, as I just learned in super squats once again, like, oh, I can maintain. I'm not gonna progressively overload the other areas, but I'm not gonna progressively deload when I progressively overload this stimulus that I am not a power lifter. Strength is not one of my strong adaptations. It was what I was focusing on then. But because I was unwilling to deload elsewhere, I burnt myself out, and it didn't take too long. I think I was I can't remember how many weeks in, but I didn't get. I think it's a 10-week program. I can't remember what it is, but I probably got
Uh-huh.
halfway through. And again, I was repping 20 reps for the most. I was getting to my 1 rep PR from before the program with 20 reps. So it's pretty amazing the adaptations I caused in that time. But what did I do on top of that? And was it worth it? I don't know. It's a funny story now. I'm okay, but pretty stupid. My coach did have an idiot for a client because I was my coach other than the book, the program I was following.
Yeah, and like it's so hard, right? Because like if I say progressive overload to you, you'll be like, "Oh, more weight on the bar," like we get so locked into
Right.
progressive overload is more weight on the bar. And
Listen,
again, this is so I love Scott's work, but Scott was obviously inspired by Louis Simmons and Westside Barbell, and like there's a real snobbery around Westside Barbell, and part of this is just so if people are fans of powerlifting, you'll have to forgive me, but powerlifting as a sport for many years it was kind of like spit and sawdust gyms, like kind of like biker culture sometimes, like it was just really rough and ready. And like in the last 10, 15, 20 years, we've had this influx of people into powerlifting, which has been so amazing. But powerlifting has really been become as a sport a lot of the time about like Excel charts. Like it's really heavy in the numbers. It's all about efficiency. It's really become quite monotone. And sometimes there's a bit of snobbery because powerlifting has become so scientifically sophisticated with what came before it. And this is not to say that Westside Barbell, which is one of those kind of dominant gyms, kind of in the, before the internet age in many respects, it's not to say that it wasn't scientific, but it did something really clever that people don't do anymore. If you look at a Westside powerlifting program, Louis Simmons, the person who popularized it, knew that people are idiots. And what I mean by that is one of the things that he did, which I think is such a clever training principle, is he would force the powerlifters to do variations on the big movements. So, okay, you're obviously doing a back squat in competition. Let's do box squats in training. Let's use a cambered bar. Let's use a safety squat bar. Okay, for a bench press, let's use a Swiss bar. Let's use like a tsunami bar, for want of a better phrase. Okay, for deadlift, let's use a hex bar. Let's do it off blocks. Let's do deficits, blah, blah, blah. Now, one of the reasons he did that is obviously just to train specific portions of the lift. But the other reason he did that was to stop people redlining the entire time in training. Because if you're just squatting or just bench pressing or just deadlifting, progressive resistance for you, progressive overload, is going to be add weight on the bar, weight on the bar, weight on the bar. If you're doing something that's different and you're like, okay, I don't really have that strong an affinity to what the outcome is, it kind of forces you to grease the groove a lot more, which so much of strength training is greasing the groove. It's about skill as opposed to the exertion of strength. And it is something that I think we tend to overlook so much, that progressive overload can be more reps on the bar. It can be working through a different range of motion. It can be using tempos, etc. Because even the best athletes feel the temptation to push themselves when they shouldn't. The late Charles Poliquin, who trained so many Olympic gold medalists, has a great story about he had two weightlifters and he set out, and they were going to the Olympics, or Olympic hopefuls at least. He set out their training blocks. He'd been working with them for months. They get to the final day, it's the platform, it's the qualifier, and they burn out and they just crash out. They don't make a single lift. Chats them after the competition. He goes, look, what the hell happened? You were looking so good in training. And they go, yeah, training was feeling so good that me and this other guy, last week we hit PRs. And he's like, just follow the program. And there's a book that I'm writing at the moment on women's Olympic weightlifting in the US, because America was the country which really helped Olympic weightlifting for women get to the Olympics. And I was talking to Jim Schmitz, a legendary Olympic weightlifting coach, and he was talking about, on Instagram, and actually Scott just had a post on Substack about this. But like, because of Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, so many people are just constantly trying to hit PRs. So many people are just constantly trying to push progressive overload with weight on the bar, as opposed to patiently following training systems, as opposed to using other means of progressively overloading. Because the problem is, and it's what I encountered when I was powerlifting, you burn out so quickly if it's just about weight on the bar. And when you look at, and something that I love looking at, is those early strong men and women from the early 1900s who would do shows once a day, twice a day for weeks on end. And you think like, well, how did these strength athletes do these incredible feats of strength for days at a time without burning out, without getting injured? And so much of it was like, sub-maximal weights, treating weight as a skill as opposed to something that needs to be, balls to the wall, berserker energy every single time. And they like nickel and dime their way to getting stronger without necessarily, burning out. And I often wonder when, and it probably was the kind of 20s and 30s when Olympic weightlifting became a sport in its own right properly, that we started to shift more towards peaking as opposed to strength as skill. And I think we oftentimes overlook strength as skill. And when you overlook that, then it is just weight on the bar, more reps, instead of thinking variations, tempos, different ranges of motion, etc. Because if you're in fitness, it's a life cycle. And that's what I mean by that is, you're training at various parts of your life. You have so much time to build strength if you let yourself, because you can't just keep adding 2, 5, 10 to the bar, because you'll hit a wall. But we like to pretend that that doesn't happen because I can handle super squats and, my calisthenics and my jujitsu and my day job and my family life and da. So that's why it is like you kind of need that hand on the shoulder to be like, enough is enough, and one thing at a time.
And I love how you say strength is a skill, and basically calling all of these adaptations skills rather than in and of themselves this one thing to chase. And Scott is largely to be thanked for my reframe of progressive overload and how I use it in my life now, because I use the word that you just said, progressive variations. So rather than, while you mentioned it, progressive overload does not just mean more weight. You can change your rep count. You can change based on the amount of weight they're using, maybe your rest time. There's a lot of things that you can do in increasing a stressor to make the challenge or the skill that you're training more difficult. However, just changing the way you do it. So there are many variations of squats, there's many variations of deadlifts and everything else. There's many modifications. You can do modified push-ups for much higher reps and make it more challenging than unmodified push-ups based on how you approach it. So you can have variations that challenge you in different ways. But my goodness, if we're always trying to peak, everyone is going to redline. So like, and especially if you're competing in that skill area and you're peaking anywhere but competition, you have an idiot for a client and or coach if it's yourself, or maybe a coach if they're trying to tell you to do that. Because yeah, peaking, for me, I train primarily alone. So if I'm trying to one rep max anytime without all the assistive like technologies around me to benefit me, I am not being very smart. And so we're lucky to have all these cool metrics now. I'd be like, okay, what's my 80%, and doing that for a few reps. Now I can kind of estimate what my one rep max will be. Great. But if I'm just staying in that one skill area of your standard deadlift or your standard squat, I'm leaving a lot on the table because I'm not doing any variation. So I'm just basically boxing myself into, okay, great, I could throw a barbell on my back, squat down and stand back up. But then you tell me to do a different type of barbell or hold dumbbells or pick up a rock with your crazy ass, which would be a lot of fun to do. It's not going to translate well. I'm very adapted to a very specific skill that is not quite functional in all other areas.
Yeah, and Mark Bell had such an interesting point on one of his podcasts where he was talking about, his slingshot, this bench press thing. I don't even know, like it's basically an elastic band is how the principle works. Just helps you lift more weight and push back up. It's great if you have shoulder pain. But Mark talked about, he had powerlifters writing to him and being like, man, I really wish I could try your slingshot, but it just doesn't fit in my program right now. And Mark's like, you couldn't spend 2 sets trying something that you wanted to try because your training program did. And it's not to insult people, but like we do hyper specialize. And it's funny, right? I teach in a school of sport and exercise science. I often say to my students that it is crazy that we have an entire school dedicated to what is effectively for most people a hobby and a pastime. I'm like, we put so much effort and emphasis on this. And you see that at like, we'll call it an amateur level. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but like so many of us do fitness as hobby, as pastime, as opposed to profession. When you are a professional, risk and pushing to extremes have to be in your job description. Because you need to be bigger, you need to be better, you need to be stronger, you need to be faster, etc. You need to be monk-like disciplined in your sport. But that's for people who are being paid to do it. You're doing this because you love it and it's fun and it's meant to be fun. But if you lock into this really specific way of doing things, I can only do these movements, I can only do these exercises. Like for me, it takes some of the joy out of physical fitness, but it also is, it's leaving gains on the table, it's leaving less injuries on the table, it's leaving enjoyment on the table. But we really do get locked into right and wrong. And there's a great book, I can't remember the author's name, but she talked about, health and fitness oftentimes takes from religions in ways that people don't realize. So we get very dogmatic, kind of like 10 Commandments style. You have to do this, thou shalt not do that. The idea of sinning, like I've had a cheat day, or like, oh, I shouldn't have done this. And what you'll find is we love dogma. So, you mentioned squats, which is such a great example of this. I actually was very lucky. I published an article on the history of the back squat in America in a strength coaching journal. And the whole purpose of that article was to show that what we think is a squat has changed massively over 100 years. If 100 years ago I said to you, right, Kyle, we're going into my home gym, we're going to do some squats. You'd be loading a barbell on your back. What the hell are you doing, man? Get on your tippy toes. What? And so you'd get up on your tippy toes and we'd squat, 20, 30 times with no weights. And then I go, okay, now let's load this up. And you'd be going back to the barbell, the back squat. And I'm going, oh, no. 5 pound dumbbells, one in each hand, tippy toes, let's go for it. And you'd be like, okay, Connor, I want to put a bar. I'll go, okay, fine. Barbell on your back, tippy toes, let's go. People only started squatting flat foot really in the 1930s. And then, once we start putting a bar on our back, our feet flat on the ground, we start increasing the weights. But then there's other people who are doing front squats. There's people who are doing hack squats. There's people who are doing, eventually in time, low bar, high bar, safety squat, half field squat, sissy squat. All of these different variations. There's people who are saying your knees can never go over your toes or else bad things will happen. There's people who are literally called knees over toes guy now.
You kind
So
of
we
look
have
like him,
like,
by the way.
oh, thank you.
You kind of look like Ben Patrick.
I bought his Nordic curl machine. Absolutely awesome. It's a genius piece of equipment.
Yeah.
If I'd known we looked like each other, I might have actually tried for a discount. But you know what I mean? Like there's something as simple as squatting. Like it's literally a natural human movement. There are so many variations of that. But then you fall into that trap of, oh, there's only one way to do it. And we can do it this way, we can't do it that way. And like if you do that, and this is where again I do love Louis Simmons, where he's like, no, do all the variations. He's like, for any compound movement, squat, bench, deadlift, there's like 20 different things that you can do. And he encouraged people to do that because I think it does help you break away from dogma, but also it does actually force you to be more efficient. And it's kind of controversial for some people where I'm like, listen, I actually think people do need a year of just dicking around in a gym, trying different sports, trying different movements, trying different rep ranges. Because I see my students and they'll come into me and they're like, "Oh, Connor, like, I'm a historian. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a coach." But they'll have their phone here and they'll be like, "Connor, look at my training program." I'm like, "Okay, this is really good." I'm like, "And how long have you been training?" They're like, "No, this is my first training program." And like, it's great, but it's really like rigid. And I'm like, if you start really rigid, I don't know if you ever expand your horizon or I think it's going to be harder for you to break out of that dogma. So like, it's funny, a friend of mine who lifts stones with me, he started off doing CrossFit, only doing CrossFit. And it was almost like trying to lure a stray cat. Like if you have a stray cat and like, you put a little bit of food near them, then you run away. You put a little bit of food near them, you run back, but like a little bit less, and you just slowly catch a monkey, try and get them to trust you. It was like that, trying to get him to just lower his cardio demands a little bit from CrossFit to focus on strength training because we were training for something really specific. But for him, it was almost like he was doing something wrong. Not in the sense of like, oh, I don't like this, it's hurting my back, it's hurting my knees, it feels awkward. But wrong is in like that religious, like, thou shalt not. It's like, thou shalt not just focus on strength for him, or thou shalt not lift a stone where your back's going to be rounded and there's asymmetry, it's going to be heavier on one side than the other side, and you're twisting in weird ways and you're hitching and blah, blah. But like, these are important things because I think, if you view fitness and the beautiful thing that you've said about, adaptations, okay, if the name of the game is adaptation, every movement you have is a tool in your toolbox. The more tools you have in your toolbox, the more efficient and more useful you can be. Now, unfortunately, most people only learn that when they get injured. Oh, flat bench press hurts my shoulders. Okay, I guess now I have to try decline, now I have to try incline, now I have to try dumbbells, now I have to try... We oftentimes only learn that through injury and we call it working around something. But like, what happens if you actually embrace the fact that exercises are made up? They don't exist. Unfortunately, when I say that, I mean, there's no one book that was handed down to us from God, Brahman, Allah, whoever we want to say, that says this is the one way to squat, this is the one way to deadlift, this is the one way to do a pull up, do a sit up, do a push up, whatever the case may be. We made up these movements and decided that they were important and efficient, and they're really good. But if you forget that they were made up, you get really dogmatic, and that's when you get in. I was once in a gym where everyone a PT had to do squat, bench, and deadlift in a powerlifting style. And it was just so funny if you like, no matter, like, the 80-year-old, the 18-year-old, the 46-year-old. And I was like, well, yeah, these movements are really effective, but you've also just forced all of your clients into one box. And the most interesting thing was when he was inducting them, he didn't tell them that he was doing this. He was like, this is what we're doing. So they were like, I want to get strong. He's like, powerlifting. I was like, okay, but maybe there's different things that they might enjoy. And his, retention rate hovered much lower than the other PTs in the small box gym because he just basically ignored what they wanted or ignored their experiences and said, thou shall bench, thou shall squat, thou shall deadlift. And then he'd be wondering why, he'd be like, that other PT is so much weaker than me. How come he has all the clients? I'm like, because he listens to his clients, my man. It's not that complicated.
He's weak.
And, this goes back to that dogma. And I think so much of fitness is dogma. Some of it because of sales, which we've talked about, but some of which because we want certainty in our lives. And fitness doesn't provide it.
And it makes me appreciate your question, the strength and conditioning coaches. I can't remember what sport you were talking to, or if it was many sports, but like, what is the minimum that you need to get to for this adaptation to translate well to this sport or this skill? Because sports, they're an art in of themselves, but they primarily contain the adaptations of the skill of that sport, whether it's swinging my leg to kick a ball, whether it's the movements of shooting a basketball, whether it's throwing a punch, you name it. These are all skills. And while there are movements that we can emulate in the gym to train power transfer in certain ways that help, like if I'm throwing a medicine ball, that can help with power.
Yep.
Sure, all of these great things that we can do to help. But like, what is that floor that you want to get to help enhance the ability to move your body for that skill that we're actually trying to train? And I'm not sure many, of course, squat maybe can help you jump quite a bit. Not maybe, definitely can help you jump quite a bit higher. But then if you're just doing heavy squat, probably want to do lighter and then actually have plyometrics involved too, and all kinds of other things. But that variation to be more efficient to get to the adaptation so you can actually train the skill that you're trying for. And it's interesting that at least the coaches you asked at the time didn't have a great answer for that, because that is their domain. Their job is based on, look, I'm showing this science and evidence-based improvements in these metrics that we are tracking, but how does that translate to performance in the craft? It's more of an art, and it needs to be highly variable and individualized and desirable by the people that you're serving. And that's going to be quite different even if you're only serving 2 people, because the individual variability you mentioned already, we need to determine, okay, what are your attributes, where are we trying to go, and most importantly, how are we evolving the skills that you currently have to apply to the domains that are most important to you?
And it's that really hard thing, isn't it, then, of like, am I progressing?
Yeah.
So, there's a really amazing exercise scientist, a good friend of mine, Eric Helms, who is a natural bodybuilder, incredible trainer. And he's talked very openly about how difficult it can be to see progress as a natural bodybuilder. Because especially if you've been in that game for long enough, it's like, okay, I might only gain like a pound of muscle in a whole year. And if my entire self worth is based on gaining muscle, I'm going to be in for a bad time. So, he talks about, seeing your body in that sense as like a sporting output, in the same way that a shot putter is able to say, okay, I threw it X amount of yards. A punter in football is able to say, I scored X amount of points last year. Distancing yourself and making the body something objective instead of subjective. But it's really hard to know, even in a strength context, your strength may not, your top level strength may not actually improve in a whole year, but your sub-maximal strength, what you can do at 90% of your 1RM may have increased exponentially. I did 2 reps a year ago, I can now do 8 reps. But when I try and pull a single, it's basically the exact same because I've not trained that single. So there's so many swings and roundabouts, and it's so hard to know what progress is if you don't have kind of set definitions or borderlines. And sport is a whole different thing because, I don't know, you know this more than me, strength and conditioning is supplementary to the sport itself. And it's really hard. And Jan Todd, Terry Todd, and Jason Shirley wrote an amazing book that everyone who's an S&C coach should read called The Invention of Strength Training, where they talk about Boyd Epley, one of the first S&C coaches in the US, being told by his head coach, I think it was in Nebraska, if anyone gets slower or gets injured, you're fired. So the very starting point of S&C work in the United States was coaches saying, I don't trust you. I don't think this will work. You need to prove your worth to me. So immediately that puts S&C coaches on the defensive. Okay, our running back, he pulled 500 pounds in deadlift last year. Now with me, he's pulled 600 pounds. Progress. But his running yards might be the exact same, might be worse, might be better. And if they got better, is that because he added 100 pounds to his deadlift, or is that because he spent more time working on his footwork on the field? So it's really hard because for a strength and conditioning coach, progress in the gym is seen to be proof that you are doing your job, which is obviously true.
Yeah.
But the problem is athletes are strength training to get better on the field. How do you get better on the field? Well, number one is usually recovery if you're a professional athlete, but number two, it's doing sports specific training, working on shimmying, working on footwork, working on passing, working on kicking, working on your tactical awareness, working on your, your defense, whatever the case may be. And this is where the like good enough field comes in. And I love reading track and field, especially shot put manuals and training programs from the 60s and 70s, because you'll see the athletes themselves oftentimes putting in rough benchmarks for others. So it's like 2 times body weight, you're as strong as you need to be for shot put. Once you hit that, just maintain, don't get injured in the gym, get out in training and practice your throws. Because now it's just technique. Or, it's a, 1.5 time body weight bench press, or it's a 350 clean and jerk, whatever the case may be. But it's really interesting because they were saying this is enough. And this is where we actually get the problem, because so many of us are recreational, trainers or athletes or lifters. So now it's really hard to know the benchmark. And it's funny, it's one of the reasons why I gravitated towards natural stone lifting. Because I'm like, oh, okay, so this stone is 190 kilos. The lift is basically to your knees. People have been doing that for 100 years or 100 plus years. Okay, I'm good. You know what I mean? Like that's my benchmark. I hit that. And I love it because historic stones of strength. They're oftentimes masculinity stones. You lifted them to prove you're a man. So now you get that ego boost of like, I'm strong enough, but I'm also a man now. But there is actually something like really fun about that. There's a stone that I lifted in Scotland last November, which I love. It's called the Saddling Mare. So it's only 100 kilos, which is relatively light for a stone, but you have to pick it up from the ground and put it and balance it on top of a huge boulder. So the boulder, I think I'm 6 foot on the button, was maybe like 6'2" or 6'3". So you have to pick up the stone and push and slide it up the boulder, get it to the top, balance it, and then you're done. And now I'm good enough. So, like I think I gravitated naturally to stones because there's a set standard, a set benchmark. That's you. People have been doing it for hundreds of years. You're not doing it for competition. You're doing it for yourself. You're doing it to be part of a community. But like so much of sport doesn't have a roof. You know what I mean? So now we have to just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And that question of like good enough or strong enough is hard because, like you with super squats, like me trying to hit a peak, every couple of weeks in powerlifting. If I'm like, what's good enough? You're like, getting stronger. Like the progress, progress, progress. So it's really hard to break that mindset.
Good enough. That'll be one of the takeaways from this conversation for sure. And of course, that's a threat to certain industries, to certain maybe even goals, because I really appreciate. I always love looking at those tables for like, here's like a beginner,
Yep.
here's advanced, here's elite. There's usually other categories in there. I am never elite in any categories for like general strength numbers. I'm usually in the whatever's after like average. So whatever's above
Yeah.
average, but not even advanced, but before that, I usually fall into there, maybe advanced in a few metrics if I'm really focused on training them. But I almost love that. Like Michael Easter writes about being super medium, and it's the same concept there. So it translates so well, but I can appreciate like when you are a power lifter, and now if you are kind of at that ceiling because you're top tier, or even if you're an amateur and you just gotta get to your red line level where if you're pushing further and hopefully you don't have to learn like our dumbasses have a few times where you red line and burn out. Now you can't eat gluten other than your wife having to order stuff overseas to make you her sourdough, which is still thankfully I can enjoy. um, but hopefully you learn that like what we talked about, progressive variation, like this is good enough for this variation of squat. Now dick around, like you said, in the gym. Find another skill similar, another type of squat or a deadlift or something else where you're still getting after it in the ways that you enjoy, but now you have a different floor to work on progressively overloading, not to the point where you are redlining, but to where you can maintain the good enough and now dick around and find a new area to raise your floor and get more functional across domains rather than be highly specialized in one and worry about trying to push that beyond what is possible for the attributes and genetics you were born with.
Yeah, and I think like so much as Connor preaching a message of lowering your standards, but it really isn't. It isn't that. But I just think there's an idea of being radically honest. So being honest with people, being honest with yourself, regardless of the consequences. And now, oftentimes, people take radical honesty as an excuse to be an asshole to someone. But if people were forced to be radically honest about what they want from strength, so or what they want from fitness. So someone's like, I want to be one of the strongest versions of myself that I can in powerlifting. And you're like, okay, let's go extreme.
Yes.
Because what you want is extreme. Because to be elite in anything is extreme. There's no athlete who has ever said, it's fine. It's easy. It's boring. Don't have to work for it. You know what I mean? Like, obviously, people have genetic advantages, but at a certain point, being elite means being extreme. I would say that while so much of fitness is for extremes, more people have gone into bodybuilding, into powerlifting, into weightlifting, into strongman, strongwoman, etc. in the last few years, more and more people have a vague idea of what they want. Most people entering in a gym setting say things along the lines of, I want to be fit, I want to be healthy, I want to be strong, I want to lose weight. If you're forced at that point to be radically honest, it makes your programming so much easier. So when I did the natural bodybuilding show, for example, I wanted to be as lean as possible and as muscular as possible. I couldn't do that, especially with my genetics. I couldn't do that without effectively having an eating disorder for 6 months out of the year and tanking my hormones. Then in powerlifting, okay, squat, bench, deadlift, I want to be strong. I'm doing these peaking programs and getting injured, coming back, peaking, getting injured, blah, blah, blah. It's stupid, but I'm getting what I want. I'm getting stronger over time. And 34 now, like for some reason, I'm mad into lifting stones. But what I want is truthfully to be injury free because I have a son and a wife and I have a heavy workload. I want to be everyday strong. So what I mean by that is I have to train myself to try and move away from 1 RM peaks into what's my 3 RM, my 3 rep max, what's my 5 rep max, what's my 12 rep max on a deadlift or a squat or a bench press, because it's going to lower the injury threshold, but still give me, progressive overload. And I want to be able to be really weird and drive 4 hours in a car, get out, pick a stone up 1 inch off the ground and then try and pick it up as heavily as possible, because that's what men and women before me have done for decades. But you know what I mean? Like, and even with the stones, I'm like, okay, this stone 130, 140, 150, blah, blah. So I want to be able to be competitive, so to speak, in lifting. But again, it's like my reasoning has always been somewhat clear, and then my training has followed my reasoning, as with the stupidity obviously built into that. But we often pretend like we're all talking about the same thing. So it's the powerlifting coach who's forcing everyone to be a powerlifter, who's forcing everyone to fetishize their SBD, their squat, bench, deadlift numbers, when maybe they just wanted to be able to pick up things from the ground without getting hurt. Or maybe they just wanted, to be able to get up out of a chair pain free. And you now have them pulling sumo, and working on, like, it's the disconnect between what you actually want. And so many of us enter with a vague idea. I want to be bigger. The fuck does that mean? You know what I mean? Like, this is the difficulty, is we enter with vagueness and then we just follow anything. But I think the beauty is when you stick around long enough, you get a better sense of why you're doing it and what you want from it. And the more important thing is what your goals represent for you. Because the way that I train and my reasons for doing it, for some people would be insanely unambitious. For other people would be insanely ambitious. For me, it's a sweet spot right now. But if I'm comparing myself to the insanely ambitious person, I'm going to push myself and move away from what I want. If I'm going to compare myself to someone who I think is unambitious, I'm going to be an ass because I'm just going to be, I'm big me, little you, which I can never be in a gym context. But it's the it's the idea that it's important to know what you want. This sounds like a live, laugh, love podcast. It really isn't. But like, we don't have these conversations in fitness. And I think they're so important because it defines everything about what you do then.
Well, one thing I know about you is you are wonderfully weird. And I am very thankful that you have the job you have so you can be radically honest in your posts as you dig into the origins of fitness, but also talking about how you apply it, what you've learned, and all the amazing people that you get to interact with because of the books that you've written, the articles that you're involved with, and the work that you're doing, which is just beyond interesting. Like I said, I'm usually interested in the origins of people. I am very interested in the origins of fitness now because of you. So stay weird, brother. I literally got to none of my questions that I thought I would ask you about, like some of the origins of certain types of fitness equipment. More about you. Like this was amazing. So good, so funny as always, like you always are in your podcast. We didn't get to talk about getting color at all. We will talk about getting color one day. I would love to talk professional wrestling with you. Another interesting aspect of your weird ass. It's just another layer of all the cool things that you are interested in and the overlap when it comes to how we can use exercise fitness. The origins of it and the application of it to better our lives in the ways that you've explained. My last question, though, that I told you I want to ask you before we started recording, about the obviously you started training. You said around, or you were training at 14 years old, powerlifting and different things. I'm curious, at what age did you take this picture of yourself for the History of Physical Culture on the cover of this book? Because I asked Scott. So the little thing I told you I'd tell you about is before the first time we scheduled, which we've had schedule conflicts come up. I'm so thankful we made this happen. It was incredible. But I asked Scott, I was like, hey, I don't think this is one of the guys who he typically writes about. Do you know who was on the cover of the History of Physical Culture? He's like, let me run to my desk real quick. He had several of your books on his desk. He was at work. So he ran, grabbed it. He looked at it. He was like, don't tell. I mean, definitely tell him, but tell him I'm disappointed in myself. I don't know who it is. I'm sorry. I was like, I'll ask him on podcast. I'll call you out. I assume this is not you when you were younger. It looks a little older than that.
No, I wish.
Who is this
I wish that was
man
me.
with the rosy cheeks on the cover of History of Physical Culture?
He is someone who appeared on Bernard McFadden's magazine, which is an early 1900s magazine called Physical Culture. And he is, and this is critically important, dead. So I got to use his image for free. So he's not well-known weightlifter, bodybuilder, powerlifter, anything like that. He is someone who submitted a photograph of himself to Bernard McFadden's Physical Culture magazine over 100 years ago, which the beautiful copyright laws mean I get to use now for free. So Voltaire said history is a trick that we play on the dead. Copyright history is definitely a trick we play on the dead. Yeah.
So appropriate, so funny, because the picture itself is hilarious. And now the story behind it, even funnier yet. My goodness, Conor, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to actually asking the questions I plan for in the future at some point. You take care, brother.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Remember, all the knowledge in the world means little unless you uniquely apply it to your life. Challenge yourself to take action. Knowledge applied is wisdom earned. Determine what is important to you and get after it with intention, effort, and consistency. Until next time, stay resilient, my friends.